Thank you. Good evening and welcome to tonight's Housing and Homelessness Public Policy and Accountability Committee. My name is Councillor Jacqueline Daly. I'm chair of this PAC, and before we begin, we've just got a couple of housekeeping points. We're being live streamed on YouTube, so by taking part, you're consenting to be recorded. If the fire alarm sounds, we'll adjourn the meeting and we're going to be leaving to the behind me and to the right, where we'll be directed to an assembly point in Riverside Gardens. We're in a completely new venue, so it's definitely worth mentioning this. For anybody here, there's tea, coffee and biscuits in the staff kitchen, and the toilets are on my left-hand side. Can I ask, we're a small meeting this evening, but can I please ask for officers to introduce themselves before they speak, just for the first time? And would everybody please use the microphone so that they can hear us at home? Okay, lovely. So first of all, apologies for absence. I have an apology for absence from Councillor Sally Taylor. And I think an apology from for lateness, sorry, from John Pixton, who's just going to be 5 or 10 minutes. Do members have any declarations of interest? Thank you. So item 3 on the agenda is the minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of November, 2023. Do members have any comments on those minutes? Councillor Alexander?
Yes, Chair. I've got a couple of points I'd like to just cover. On page 8 of the minutes, where we're talking about there'd be further elaboration on communications, record keeping and in-service audits. I've not heard anything since then from the council whatsoever, and I'll just assume that something's going on in the background, but I haven't been updated. Or is that about right?
Yes, Councillor Alexander, I'm happy to take it offline with you to show you what service improvement plans we're undertaking in housing, and the audits what are occurring. So
yeah, it's in the section on page 8 of the minutes. Then on page 10, the procurement systems, and there was some general stuff as well as the issues around greening, and some questions about leaseholders and how they might be involved and how people in street properties might be involved. And again, I've not heard anything further since then.
Discussions are happening internally to look at how we actually look at the green agenda and how we manage that. So we are working with our colleagues in the climate emergency team to understand what we can actually, how we can actually deliver that project.
Yeah, thank you. I would like some update, an update, because I am getting questions from leaseholders in particular on that issue, but it applies to the whole across the housing stock, and also
Chair.
people who are wanting to insulate their.
Sorry, Councillor Ume, you'd like to say something?
Sorry to interrupt. I was just going to suggest, because I was going through the minutes to see the specific actions, if perhaps, Councillor, you can share them with Debbie and those can be picked up to be addressed. Because, I mean, as Richard was saying, there are loads of discussions happening, but if there are some specific elements that haven't been captured and acted upon following the meeting, it'd be good to make sure that those are actioned.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And
thank you very much.
The final one was on, again, on page 10 with co-production. And I'd like to hear more about what the council's doing.
Thank you, Councillor Alexander.
Yeah, if you could highlight those points, because I must admit, just going through, I'm at a loss as to find these points, but it just would be really useful, because I can also see Richard struggling to see them, just to be clear what those actions were and make sure that they're captured for the next meeting.
Debbie, would you mind coordinating that?
It's the sound I'm getting.
Some feedback.
It's getting a ring.
I think it's when there's more than one microphone on in the room, perhaps.
I'm going to ring as nice as you are.
Debbie, would you mind just coordinating that with Richard Shway and Councillor Alexander? Thank you. So do members agree the minutes of that meeting? Thank you. Which leads us straight on to item number 4 and the 2024 medium-term financial strategy. We have with us Sigmund Kelsey and Daniel Rochford to speak to that, and John Pixton here to support, and Richard Shway, apologies. Can I first of all invite Councillor Rowan Reid to give an overview of the strategy? Councillor Reid.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, committee members, for inviting me here today to speak about the budget. So the headlines are essentially that this is quite a difficult time for local government to be putting budgets together. Despite the difficult circumstances that we're in, we've managed to put together a budget that protects not just the core services, but then those extra special services that make Hammersmith and Fulham unique, that our residents value so much. And this has only been possible because of the ruthlessly financially efficient approach that we take to setting and managing budgets, but also the continuous process of reform that we undergo as a council. Before I kick off, I'd just like to start by thanking the officers without whom we wouldn't have a budget here today, whether that's Sukhvinder and his excellent finance team who make sure that all the numbers add up, whether it's the officers in the departments who are doing such an excellent job throughout the year of managing budgets and identifying savings, and thanks as well to the cabinet members like Councillor Ume who do a brilliant job throughout the year of managing their budgets, but also getting as much as they possibly can out of every pound of taxpayers' money. Now, I'm sure the committee don't need to hear from me that this is a difficult time for local government finance. You just need to open a newspaper or turn on the radio and you hear news of the next council to have got into financial difficulty, whether it's Woking or Birmingham. We hear that 1 in 5 councils across the country now expect to issue a Section 114 notice this year, essentially saying that they don't think they can meet their financial obligations on a day-to-day basis. This is made even harder because of the rampant inflation that we're seeing in the wider economy and the general economic malaise we've seen for over a decade now. I just wanted to reassure any residents who are watching this evening or councillors who might have residents coming to them with concerns. I know that a lot of people across the borough rely on the services provided by this council, rely on this council for financial support and other support. I wanted to reassure them that this council is not in difficult financial situations. Last year, we managed to run a budget surplus. We underspent on our budget. We contributed money to reserves at a time when most councils around the country are actually taking money out. At the last audit committee meeting, the auditor, our external auditor from Grant Thornton, said that we were actually one of the best run councils in the country. You know, if you're somebody out here in Hammersmith and Fulham who's relying on council services, you don't need to worry that they're going to disappear. You know, this is a well-run council, our budgets are managed efficiently, and the services are going to be there for you. That said, you know, when we started this process of setting the budget, we did so from a position of having our grant from central government cut by 56% in real terms since 2010. We started this year with a budget gap of £25 million. That means before we can spend a single extra penny, we had to find £25 million of savings. That's just the reality of the situation that we're in at the moment. I'm pleased to say that we have managed to do that. And despite the difficult conditions that we find ourselves in, we've managed to set a balanced budget as we're required to do. We've managed to continue to invest in the core services, the services that residents rely on, things like our homelessness services, which I'm sure we'll discuss this evening. But we've also managed to invest in those extra services that make Hammersmith and Fulham unique. Things like our free breakfasts for primary school children, things like our local law enforcement team, things like our free home care, things like our council tax support scheme. All of these things that we do above and beyond what other local authorities do, that our residents rely on. But that's only been possible because of the ruthlessly financially efficient approach that we take to managing budgets here in Hammersmith and Fulham, and because of our ethos of continuous public service reform. Now, you know, reform's a small word. You hear it bandied about quite a lot. There are 3 areas of reform I wanted to touch on. Technological reform, organisational reform, and then reform in terms of the policies that we're funding through this budget. So in terms of technology, we are seeking to be at the forefront, the cutting edge of the use of new technology in local government. We're using artificial intelligence in our adult social care budget to reduce costs and provide a better service. We're using robotics and automated processing in our revenue and benefits team to make sure that it's running as efficiently as possible. And we're going to continue looking at the what the latest technology can do to support us and to make sure that we can carry on providing the best quality services to residents. In terms of organisational reform, we're looking to save money across the council through 4 large corporate savings programmes. We're going to be looking at the council's property portfolio, our commercialisation activities, our staffing, and our use of data to try and make sure that we're squeezing as much as we possibly can out of our resources in these areas and try and save money for the future. And finally, in terms of policy, through this budget, we're funding new reforms to the way that the council delivers its services, things like our family hubs, which are a new way to take the services of the council out to the council where residents are, to make sure that people are able to access all of the services that we provide and to make sure that these are getting as far as they can across the borough. I'm going to hand over to Sukhinder now, who's going to spend a bit more time talking about some of the details of the budget. I'll be happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Ree. Can I ask a question in the meantime? Councillor Reid just mentioned family hubs being a kind of an area in the communities. Can residents access housing and homelessness services from those family hubs?
It's something which we are exploring, Councillor Daly. One of the things which we're doing a lot better over the last year is working a lot more closely with colleagues in adult social care and also children's services. So we are doing a lot more working to complement each other on those matters. There's also work which we're also doing with the refugee programme as well. So we are looking at all those things. But I would like to say that what we're trying to do is use services which are already in existence to actually deliver the services what's needed. Hopefully that answers your question, Councillor Daly.
Yeah, if I could come in on that as well. I think the idea is that eventually these will become sort of one-stop shops for residents to be able to come in and access whichever council services they need, right? You know, there's no reason why when you go in to talk about the children's services that the council provides, you can't find out a bit more about the cost of living support that's available, or you know, you may also have questions about your position on the housing waiting list or something like this. And so the idea is that eventually these will become hubs where residents will be able to access all council services that they need.
Thank you, Councillor Reid. Mr. Kelsey? Not quite there. Okay. Ready? We can get some help for that, can we? Thank you.
And apologies, Chair, I was slightly late. There was severe transport problems with the rail strikes.
Understandable. Thank you for coming.
that will summarize some of the key issues that are in that report. So I'm going to focus on the corporate budget position. Danny, in a few moments, will go through the housing solutions budget and also the HRA. That's how we've done both last year to scrutiny as well. So if I just go through these slides for a few moments for members of the committee. So there are a few things that I'd just like to run through, if I may.
I think what we need to do is just click.
Okay. Fine. So there are 4 things that I'd just like to go through for members of the committee. A little bit about our strategic operating environment, which I think members of the committee will know about. Say something about our financial plans and the key objectives that underpin those, and something about how we've achieved those over the past few years also. Then say a bit more about the proposed budget for 24-25, particularly some of the investment that we're going to be putting into services and some of the proposals for efficiencies that then allow us to balance the budget overall. Just finally concluding on looking forward really on the medium term, which will continue to be difficult for councils as they will be for local authorities. And then just to say a little bit about what happens next after our meeting tonight on this. So our strategic operating environment, I think Councillor Rhee has explained those matters very clearly. It's going to continue to be very difficult. The turbulence that we're seeing from inflation and high interest rates, that's going to put enormous pressure on our services. We're seeing our contractors wanting to see extra allocations for the services that they provide. Interest rates themselves are going to make us relook and review some of our regeneration schemes to make sure that they continue to be affordable. I'm hoping that over the next 18 months or so, both of those pressures will ease and that overall inflation and interest rates will start to come down overall. I think the outlook for the economy as well and household budgets, as outlined by the Chancellor on his speech to Parliament on the 22nd of November, is that the economy continues to be stagnant really. Unemployment will be about 4% in total overall. And household incomes aren't really going to grow over the medium term. All that's going to put pressure on our residents, and that's going to make them rely more and more on the services that the council provides, from children's services, adult social care, housing, and all the services that the council provides overall. We've also got continuing pressures and new legislative burdens. I've just mentioned a couple there that the government will be introducing, the Environment Act and the Social Regulation Act. Both are recent. They will have some wide-ranging implications and financial ramifications that we will need to go through and sort out. There is increasing regulation from government, and I've just picked on a couple of things there overall to explain that. Off-log is something that's been introduced in the current year, where local authorities will have to report on the performance indicators that are selected nationally, CQC, Ombudsman. So increasing regulation really for the sector will continue overall. We're seeing uncertainty in the kind of local government financing regime overall. Much of the changes that were talked about over the past few years, business rates reforms, fair funding, social care reform, have either been done only partially or have been shelved and will be delayed to the future. All that creates a bit of uncertainty for us in terms of projecting and how we plan for our resources overall. And the council has got a number of major regeneration projects that it does need to complete, particularly Civic Campus, Hammersmith Bridge, and all the housing developments that we're planning to do overall. So a little bit there about our sort of operating environment. In terms of planning our finances, there are some objectives that we're trying to underpin overall in terms of setting our resource envelopes. Now, they're really my words, but effectively they reflect the values that the council has already established, the 6 values that it uses in the delivery of all its services overall. But I've summarized it in a slightly different way here. So there are 6 there that I've focused on. Firstly, and importantly, the council has a number of statutory responsibilities, and we want to make sure that we continue to provide those services. And they will be across adults, children's, housing services, and all the other services that the councils provide. It's very important that we make sure we continue to deliver services that are valued by businesses, our residents, and visitors to the borough. That's from community safety to all the other services that we provide as a council. There are at least between 50 to 60 different services that the council provides to all residents, businesses, and visitors overall. Safety is very important for those same communities. The council has established the law enforcement team for about 3-4 years now. 70 strong staffing complement there to deliver and provide safety services to the borough. We want to make sure that we promote the prosperity of the borough. The council has got an established industrial strategy. It's encouraging investment from the medical sector, from the sciences and from the research sectors. That's helping to grow the borough and the business overall, increasing the employment prospects and the kind of prosperity of the borough overall. Councillor Ree has talked a little bit about the council being agile, modern and innovative, so I won't say too much about that. There are things that we want to obviously do and deliver. And underpinning all that is making sure that we continue to be a strong and well-governed authority from a financial perspective. So Councillor Ree has also talked a little bit about what the external auditor said at the meeting in December. So I've always reflected really on how the council has really been able to achieve many things that other local authorities have not been able to do. And some of those examples, Councillor Ree has explained very, very clearly. But to me, these are some of the things that the council has done, which has allowed it to maintain those services and to make sure that it's been financially resilient overall. We have delivered about £118 million worth of savings since 2014-15. They've been across all services, mainly to do with reducing our property portfolio, the corporate programs that Councillor Ree talked about earlier, to make sure that we are working with our partners in the private sector, commissioning services in the best possible way overall. The council has been very successful at generating Section 106 and SIL resources. It's worked well with the developer sector. As we've seen more and more developments occurring, then there's been a greater contribution that the council has been able to secure. More than £100 million delivered there. And Cabinet in November considered a report that articulated and set out how the council had spent almost £19 million worth of resources across 22-23, and will carry on with those levels over the next few years to provide services to local communities and residents, including the LET team overall. The council is also quite successful in making sure that we are recovering income where we can do so, charging for services where we're allowed to do so. So about £60 million or so on an annual basis is recovered through that. Many of our services are run on a net neutral basis, not costing the general fund any resources whatsoever overall. So we will continue with that theme. A few other things which I'll just mention in general terms. We are working well through national programs and trying to secure as many resources as we can, whether that's the Green Agenda, Levelling Up program, although that's been targeted towards authorities in the north of the country, working collaboratively with our public sector colleagues, particularly the NHS, the GLA, and also other local authorities, doing procurement and commissioning on a London-wide basis. Greater and modern use of IT systems. Councillor Ree has talked about that a little in more detail. And of course, using technologies, including analytics, artificial intelligence, to improve how we deliver our services to our residents. Just very quickly to summarize some of the key assumptions that we've made in setting the budget for 24-25. So pay and prices at 3% and 5% respectively. I think that's a reasonable level to set for the budget for next year. Inflation at the moment increased in December to 4%. So we'll see how next year the overall numbers pan out. The OBR is indicating that the target about 3% will be achieved during 24. So I think that's a reasonable set of proposals on inflation that the council is moving forward with. Investment in the delivery of our key council priorities, £10.7 million has been set aside for that. And I'll say a couple of words about that in a moment. The council tax overall, there are proposals to change that from April 24. So you can see the numbers there overall. What I can say is that in the National Revenue Grant Settlement that were announced in the Houses of Parliament just before Christmas, in fact on the 18th of December, then there's an assumption that overall local authorities, although our spending power has increased by about 7%, we're expecting to generate 5% of that through our own resources. So that's how that particular grant settlement has worked through. We're expecting to see more domestic properties in the borough, roughly about 750 to 1,000 properties more on an annual basis. That obviously generates more income, but it of course means more services need to be provided to our residents too. And we're maintaining a reasonable level of contingency in our budgets to ensure that it doesn't jeopardize the provision of our frontline services overall. So just one quick slide to talk a little bit about our council tax position overall. So the council has one of the lowest Band D council tax levels across the country. I think it's the third lowest. For 5 out of the last 9 years, the council has either frozen or reduced the charges for the council overall. So the current Band D tax is £871. Had the council increased those charges in line with what the government had recommended, our council tax would have been over £1,000. In fact, almost 1,070. So each resident is almost benefiting about £200 or so lower than what it would be otherwise. In terms of our total numbers of properties, there's an exemplification there of how our 93,000 dwellings pan out. 4% of our residents will pay nothing at all and will be fully exempt. Students, care leavers, vacant properties overall. And a further 11% are protected through the council tax support scheme. So they won't pay anything either overall. 27% further will qualify for a single person discount, and that's equivalent to 25% of the total council tax, worth about £170 to £180 per year per person. And at the moment, we anticipate that slightly over half of the residents will be expected to pay the council tax in full. And the government assumptions, important to note that over the medium term, is that the public finances are expecting councils to increase their taxes on council tax by 5% at least until 27-28 overall. I'll just say a quick couple of words about how the budget was balanced in 23-24 and 24-25. So we started the year with a balanced budget overall. Pay and price inflation is going to increase our costs by 13.7%. That's the 3% and the 5% that I referred to earlier. We're going to be investing almost £11 million in new services that protect the priorities and the key services that are valued by residents of the borough. We continue to make sure that we spend our resources efficiently and well, about 8.1 million put together for that, mainly to do with how we commission our services externally and how we work with our partners and how we want to reduce our support service functions and our overheads overall. So we've also included in there assumptions for interest income that we'll get next year, changes to the grant regime overall, 12.3, and the council tax requirement will generate 4 million. So they are the pluses and minuses that would lead us to balance the budget for 24-25. I'll just say a couple of quick words about the savings proposals. They're summarized in here by service. And as I've indicated earlier, they're mainly to do with how we work with our partner authorities, the NHS, how we commission our services. I won't go through those in full detail here, but the schedules attached to the report set all those out in total. Some of them are income related, so we're going to be generating a bit more from commercial advertising as the sector picks up and more income is generated through there. In terms of our allocations for investment in services, so I've tried to summarize in this slide some of the key service areas and where the investment would be placed. Almost £11 million in total. 4.2 million will be going for our home care services. 1,500 residents of the borough benefit from that service, receiving anything from 7 hours to 28 hours of service per week. And that's a service we recently tendered. We've now got patch-based contracts. And so we're investing in that service to make sure that that's continued for the council overall. Transition services where children are moving to adult services. a very important phase for those young people. So the council is investing 600,000 to make sure that that transition is effective and works well overall. If we need to put more resources in that, we'll look at that in future years and see how we can improve that. So children's and adults are working closely together to make sure that there's minimum impact on those people who are transitioning into adulthood. Homelessness is a key pressure across the nation, especially so in Greater London. There are, when the last statistics were measured, almost 180,000 people are homeless across London. That's almost the number of people and residents in the entire borough of Hammersmith and Fulham. So we're going to be seeing some pressures there on that service. And therefore, we're going to invest an extra 1.5 million in that service. The council has always done very well there. We've avoided putting families in bed and breakfast, and we'll continue to do that. We've got some private leasing property schemes which are very efficient and well, and we'll work with our landlords to make sure that standards are maintained and that those homes continue to be provided to people who need that as we transition them to other ways of getting their housing. School transport is something very important that the council will be investing in. Almost 550 school children will be getting that transport service from next year. And that's been an increase of almost 100 more school children. So that's where the extra 1.3 million also will be invested. Housing services, 1.7 million we want to invest in that service. That's more to do with us, how we look at the HRA and how costs are charged into that service. The HRA does need to be supported and protected overall. So 1.7 million will be allocated to the HRA through rebalancing those recharges. And there are one or two others when they're family hubs, very important as well. That's just continuing the program that we've done about how we provide services overall. There's a bit of investment that went in the current year and in 21-22, and we'll carry on with that in future years. And there are a wrap up overall about 1.1 million. We're investing in our waste services, the collection of the waste through the provisional, not the provisional, but the wheel bin services overall, completing some of our major projects, particularly Civic Campus, and also making sure that the council continues to be secure as far as cyber security is concerned. A very important matter for councils. We've seen many examples in the public sector where local authorities, the NHS and others have had to spend considerable amounts of money to rectify matters. So we will continue to make sure that the council is secure in that respect. Just the last couple of quick slides overall. So just a couple of comments on the reserves summary overall. It's very important that the council maintains adequate reserves. That's important, particularly in the current times where we've got all the pressures on the economy, the inflation and the interest rates and other demands from national government. Our overall resources and reserves are not too dissimilar to what other London authorities are. In fact, we'll probably be slightly in a better position than they will be. A number of local authorities in London are planning to use some of their balances and reserves to balance the budget for 24-25. And we're keeping at least minimum balances of between 19 and 23 million. That's a recommended range that the external auditors have suggested to us, and that's what we will maintain overall. We're not using any reserves to balance the budget for 24-25, which I think is a great achievement for the council. The only resources that we'll be using is specifically where we've got some particular programs like the IT upgrade. So we've set aside those and we'll be using those to just manage and implement that overall. Just a quick mention on the medium-term forward look. Councillor Ree has articulated that in eloquently earlier. I think the kind of operating environment that we're facing at the moment will continue for a little while longer yet, maybe another 18 months or so. The public finances will continue to be difficult. We'll see what the Chancellor has to say on the 6th of March when he announces his spring budget in terms of what the future prospects might be on that. I can't see any reduction in the short term on regulation, inspection regimes, and all the assessments that we'll see nationally. And of course, all the demographic pressures that we're seeing, increasingly local authorities are finding pressures on adult services, children's services, and temporary accommodation and homelessness. So we'll continue to see those. And for the moment, we've made a kind of a forecast over the next 3 years or so. It's an average of about £12 million further gap over the next 3-4 years. Not a place I want to end really by saying to you that there's a further gap to achieve, but it's better to know about those numbers so we can plan and think about how we deliver those. So just a little bit about what happens next. We're just going through the PAC committees with all the proposals. The Cabinet will consider the budget proposals on the 12th of February, and then full council on the 20th of February will consider the full budget proposals and the debate on that. So, Chair, with that, sorry if I've taken slightly longer, but that's a run through and an overview about the budget proposals, the details of which are in the report. And there's much more detail in there, together with the savings proposals, the investment proposals, and all the other background to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for presenting a balanced budget under what must be very trying conditions, and for safeguarding those services. Councillor Ume, would you like to add anything now? No. Okay. Can I ask members, do you have any questions? Councillor Alford, please.
Thank you. You gave a very clear and succinct description of what's happening. I'd like to sort of dwell down a bit more into particularly the savings and proposals with the housing solutions. Now, you talk about efficient commissioning of temporary accommodation. Well, with the greatest respect, I've been around rather a long time, and I keep on hearing it virtually every budget meeting. We're going to be doing it more efficiently. Were we so wildly inefficient, and what efficiencies can we now make this time? And how are we making these efficiencies? And what are these efficiencies? And again, over the years, I've heard about that we would stop using agency staff, which is, I think, what your suggestion is for the review of the housing solutions team. That's something we've been talking about for a very long time. Why hasn't it happened? And is it any likelihood that this will actually manage to happen this time? And I'd like to know more about the acquisition of housing for temporary accommodation. I think that's a fairly...
Thank you.
We have the presentation of housing solutions.
If that's what you want to do, yes.
I was going to suggest that the Chair, if you agree with you that what Councillor Alford has asked for is that all the questions you do for presentation of
I understand. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Let's leave.
I've made a note of those, and we'll make sure Councillor Alford that we cover all those items in a moment, because that will give you the context of some of those things that you just asked for.
And I suppose the final question is a more general one, which I'll be asking, I suspect, if I get sent to Cabinet, is do you really think we can keep our balances as you've stated them? Because as I think it's pretty obvious at every Cabinet meeting, I worry about balances.
I mean, I'm very happy to come in on that one. Yeah, you know, it's obviously very difficult trying to set a budget in the conditions that we're working in. You know, obviously inflation has been, you know, through the roof in the last few years. You're very much trying to hit a moving target when it comes to setting budgets. It's also not particularly helped by the chaotic way in which central government allocates funding towards local government, right? We found out the final figures for our local government financial settlement on the 18th of December, right? So that the last week Parliament was sitting before Christmas. You know, a lot of the budget setting process, obviously it's been going on for months now, you know, is based on trying to come up with assumptions, really assuming a sort of worst case scenario, and the government's been pretty good at hitting that worst case scenario, I think, for the last few years now. You've also had, this is the 6th year in a row we've been given a single year budget settlement, right? So we could, it would be a lot easier for us to plan ahead when it comes to setting budgets if we were given multi-year settlements, which we used to have, but you know, being told at the last minute what you're going to get for a very short period of time does make planning very difficult. So I certainly take the point that you're making there. You know, I think we've got a pretty good record when it comes to sticking to our budgets. Last year, as I say, we managed to come in under budget. We contributed extra money to our general reserves at a time when most councils are actually taking money out of theirs, as Mr. Kelsey said. Yeah, I'm pretty confident that when it comes to planning these budgets, we're building adequate contingency measures in place. We're allowing enough flexibility when it comes to inflation in terms of pay and prices. So yeah, I wouldn't be signing up a budget I wasn't confident that we'd be able to hit.
I mean, I do appreciate we're living and have been living in very difficult times. And I'm not disputing anything that you've said about the difficulties of whoever was in power with a central government who couldn't manage to get their figures, you know, that I would be agreeing with you on that. It's not a political matter. It's straight budgeting. But I always worry, as you know, and I keep on stressing this, that God forbid, and I do mean God forbid, there was a disaster. Would we have enough in the kitty to helpfully deal with it? Because, you know, I'm going to use it because we're here in this building. And I think I probably was the only councillor, and you know, as a councillor when the building blew up next door in Riverside Gardens, because unfortunately one of our residents had got somebody to do it on the cheap, install their cooker, which then ignited and blew the refrigerator up. And how we didn't have the fatalities, I do not know, but we had to cover for that. Now, as I say, heaven forbid it ever happens again, but we have to deal with these things. And I would like to be reassured that, because it was a massive building thing, because we had to rebuild half of, or not half, we had to build one block in Riverside Gardens because of the damage.
Yeah, I mean, if you are sent to the next cabinet meeting, you'll see a fascinating paper about the council's insurance procurement that we're going to be going through. But no, in terms of the point on reserves, I know this is something that you have raised several times, and you're absolutely right to raise it. It's absolutely something that we are keeping an eye on. As the Section 151 officer, Sukhvinder has to make recommendations based on how much money we should be putting aside for, an emergency. I often say a sort of a rainy day fund, but it's actually, you're right. It could be something far more serious than a rainy day. It could be something dreadful that we need additional funds to recover from. The range that Sukhvinder has given was between 19 and 23 million pounds. We're within that. We're well within that. We're sort of over halfway within that. We're constantly looking to make sure that we have enough in reserves. If we can put extra aside at the end of the year, we certainly aim to. But I'm confident that we have a prudent approach when it comes to planning for reserves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Reid. May I ask a question on growth allocations? I notice that, or I wonder, am I right in thinking that some of those growth allocations are actually compulsory spending? And then I was wondering whether some of those funds are there because of external pressures, or whether it's a matter of ambition.
Yeah, so I think that there's a difference between committing to deliver a service and then committing to deliver a really high quality service. So let's take the biggest of those new growth proposals around adult social care, £4.8 million extra to be spent on the service. I think we're unique in terms of councils, in terms of providing free home care, free breakfasts, the LET teams, all the other services that I've gone through. But we want to make sure that we're not just providing the basic level of service. We want to make sure that the quality is high, and that those providing the service have time to care and are properly trained to do it. The extra spending is part of a new procurement process to make sure that the quality of our adult social care is as high as we would want it to be for any of our relatives if they had to go through this service. So we've got also the growth in the housing services team. You can see just from walking through London that homelessness is on the up, and because of the various largely because of the various economic factors that we've discussed earlier as part of the presentations. So there is additional pressure on the service. And we want to make sure that actually we're not just funding the service at the most basic level, we're funding it to an extent that we're able to cope with, as you say, the extra demand that comes from that. There are, entirely new growth proposals, things like the family hubs, which we touched on earlier, but a good chunk of these new investment proposals are making sure that we're filling the gaps that have been created by additional demand, by the difficult economic circumstances, and making sure that we're providing the best quality of services that we possibly can.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions on the general medium-term financial strategy from members? No. Can I ask the public, Mr. Thurloway? No? Okay, lovely. In which case, do members, do members agree to note the report? Thank you. And I think we can move on to the housing report. And are you presenting this one?
Good evening. I am Councillor Daly.
Thank
Good
you.
evening, everyone. I'm Danny Rochford. I'm the head of finance that's responsible for the Economy General Fund, and I'm here to present the MTFS proposals for the Housing Solutions Division. I just want to take a few moments, if you'll permit me, for those of you that don't know me. I know most of you around the table do know me, but there'll be people online that don't. I need to let you know that I have a stammer, I have a speech impediment. This means that I use a breathing technique, and I will sometimes speak quite mechanically. And it helps me to tell you this, as it allows me to get some control over my speech. I also hope it helps you to know this, so that you can concentrate not on how I'm speaking, but on the message that I'm delivering. Thank you for that moment of indulgence. Right, so just to give you an overall comment on the business of the housing solutions, the division is primarily concerned with delivering the council's homelessness functions, including homelessness prevention and assessment. It also is responsible for allocations of housing and lettings, as well as leading on the rough sleeping reduction strategy and the council's support for refugees and the housing strategy overall. So what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to take you through the current financial and strategic operating environment for the council's housing solutions service. I'm going to talk through the budget strategy and give you an overview of the proposed budget for next year, and then provide a bit more detail on the savings, growth and inflation for next year, and also talk a little bit about the financial risks. So the current strategic environment for the council's housing solutions service is extremely challenging. There are increasing demands for homelessness services, and there's a chronic lack of supply of temporary accommodation. I should say that increase in homelessness, as I think that Vinda's already mentioned, it's not peculiar to Hammersmith and Fulham, it's happening at a national level. Rough sleeping in London increased by 24% in the quarter to the end of September last year, and by 22% in this borough. So Vinda, I think, mentioned earlier about the 180,000 people that are now homeless in London, and how that's equivalent to the entire population of the borough. Thought that was worth repeating. On the supply side, there's been a 41% reduction in the amount of London properties that are available for private rent since the COVID-19 pandemic. And then on the finance side, we've seen a combination of high inflation and high interest rates for some time now, and evidence in the London rental market continues to show significant increases in rents. And within the council's temporary accommodation portfolio, we've seen rent increases in bed and breakfast accommodation, for example, of 17% over recent months. So the council does, fortunately, and has taken steps to have longer term agreements with many landlords that are in place, which have helped to hold down the effect of inflation. But as the cost of living crisis impacts on landlords over time, they are seeking to recover these costs through increasing rents, or alternatively withdrawing their accommodation from the market entirely. The government's recent announcement also on restoring the local housing allowance rates to the 30th percentile of local rents will be helpful, because it will enable private sector tenants to benefit from higher rates of housing benefit or universal credit, enabling them to pay their rent on their private sector properties. But this won't apply to council leased temporary accommodation, which will remain, or the amount of housing benefit or universal credit that the council is able to generate is based on the January 2011 local housing allowance. So although there may be some respite in slowing down the rate of increase of homelessness approaches to the council, the income that the council is going to receive to cover the rents for its temporary accommodation households remains 13 years out of date and bears little relation to the rents that our temporary accommodation team are being asked to pay. Next slide, please. This chart here just demonstrates the continuing increasing of the pressures that we're seeing coming through on household homelessness approaches. And that clearly shows that there's been a steep rise in the number of homelessness approaches for a persistent period of time. And given the current cost of living crisis, the lifting of the ban on evictions, the longer term impact of COVID, the expanded council duty towards victims of domestic violence, the expiry of sponsorships for refugees, we're seeing higher numbers coming through, and we expect this to continue for the rest of this year and continue into next year. What we're seeing now really is out of the ordinary. Another graph here that demonstrates how the number of households potentially placed in temporary accommodation has until recently been contained, because we've been able to place clients into the private rented sector. That's what that red line is there. But the accumulated number of private rented sector placements over the last 5 years is about 1,500. We've been able to put 1,500 households into the private rented sector. And if we hadn't been able to do that, temporary accommodation numbers today could be more than double the current 1,390, I think is the most up-to-date number that we have. And that strategy has avoided significant costs for the council's general fund. But of course, we're now seeing demand pressures continue to increase, but also the supply is drying up. And that's going to increase the number of families, number of households that end up in temporary accommodation. I want to turn to our budget strategy, which in the face of these considerable challenges, the strategy aims to achieve 5 key outcomes, which is to deliver additional savings next year on top of the 1.5 million of revenue savings that we've recently achieved for the service. We also need to manage inflationary pressures on temporary accommodation through tighter control of temporary accommodation placements and working to negotiate the best possible outcomes with landlords to make sure that we've got a good supply of appropriate accommodation. Continue to work towards reducing rough sleeping, and continue our prevention activity, including financial and practical support to sustain tenancies, to work more closely mediating with landlords to prevent homelessness happening in the first place, making sure that there's access to things like discretionary housing payments, and maximising use of other housing options, including supported housing. And also there's a little point at the bottom there about making sure, as Vinda mentioned earlier, that we have no families in bed and breakfast accommodation for longer than 6 weeks, and continuing to provide support through our refugee support programme. This slide gives you an overview of the budget proposed for next year. The expenditure is in the pie chart on the top right and the income on the bottom left. Running temporary accommodation from a financial point of view is really all about containing costs. It costs the council about £6,000 every year for every household that we put into private sector lease properties, and considerably more, about £14,000 at the moment when we put people into bed and breakfast accommodation. But we also make sure that we utilise the available grant income we get from central government, mostly in the form of homelessness prevention grant, maximising income from the benefits system, and containing the procurement costs of accommodation, and of course effective use of the staffing resource that we have. The net budget overall of £13 million reflects the financial reality of temporary accommodation, which is that we can't cover all of our costs. It costs us £43 million, or it will next year, to deliver the service, but we're likely to generate about £29 million of income, mainly due to those constraints on local housing allowances that I touched upon earlier. And of course, we also have a duty to provide statutory services and commitments such as trying to bring an end to rough sleeping. It's worth mentioning that overall, the Housing Solutions team have managed to, for the last 4 years consecutively, balance their budget every single year. So the financial performance in the team is excellent. And having delivered a 1.5 million savings programme, which completed last year, a further review of the service is expected to deliver further savings. But of course, the sheer level of increases in demand for homelessness, coupled with the lack of supply and the increases in unit costs, means that the service will require some growth in the budget, as Vinda mentioned earlier, and also to cover inflationary pressures due to the increasing cost of renting temporary accommodation. Thank you. And that brings us on to the list of savings, growth and inflation. So we can expand upon this later. Savings of 0.4 million are expected to be delivered from improvements in the efficient commissioning of temporary accommodation, and also from the acquisition of the council's own temporary accommodation. The plan's also to deliver some savings from reviewing the organisational structure. However, those savings will be more than offset by the need for growth. The plan is to provide additional investment of 1.5 million, which will be needed to enable the council to meet the demand for temporary accommodation. That's an increase in the number of homelessness presentations, combined with the reduction in the supply, means that we are anticipating much higher client numbers, and we're expecting to see a net increase of between 3 and 4 tenants per week, week on week, over the course of next year. And that will probably cost us around £1.5 million. On top of that, the significant increases in the unit costs means that we've been seeing increases or evidence within the London rental market of 15% increases, that kind of size of increase. And so the service is managing inflationary pressures on temporary accommodation through effective procurement and negotiation with landlords. However, an inflationary uplift in the temporary accommodation budget of 0.9 million will be required for 24-25. And we will continue to try to contain those to 0.9 through the various mitigating actions that the service carries out. Next slide, please. Okay, this is my last slide. As in previous years, there is, of course, when you set any budget, no absolute certainty. So there are a number of risks relating to temporary accommodation, particularly in the volatile climate that we're witnessing presently. The risks relate to increases in the numbers of households in temporary accommodation, increases in the costs of procuring that accommodation, increases in the proportion of households in temporary accommodation, which are larger family groups, and an increase in approaches. We've set out a series of mitigating actions which will be developed further as the months carry on, which will aim to minimise these risks and to help to contain any budget pressure arising from these sources.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that presentation. Can I ask you about so how to pose this question properly? Last week at the Oversight Board, we were presented with a cliff base, which is the end of the Household Support Fund coming on the 31st of March. And then we were told that a decision on what may or may not replace that won't come away until March itself, so a couple of weeks before. Now, we know, we see the figures there, that pressures on households translate into incredible pressures on the Homelessness Prevention Fund. And I'm wondering what sort of contingencies we have in that budget, should there not be household support in the way that we've had it for the past year? Have we sort of allowed for that in contingencies?
We're certainly aware of it, and we've certainly taken account of it. It is unfortunate that there was the recent announcement that the expectation isn't that the Household Support Fund will be continuing, although we've then more recently there's been some uncertainty about that, and now we're waiting to hear in March. So we're very hopeful that there will be a positive announcement in March. I think in terms of temporary accommodation, the amount that the Household Support Fund contributed was in the couple of $100,000s. So it's not a huge number, but it's still significant in the context of the budget overall. However, we do also have access to other funds, other pots of money, such as the discretionary housing pot. And we have all the various mitigating activity, prevention activity, supported housing initiatives that we have. So we're confident that we still have a very strong service offer to support people. But of course, we will miss, if it doesn't come back, we will miss the Household Support Fund.
Thank you.
Yeah, could I comment on that as well, please, Chair? Yeah, I think this does go back, I think, to the answer I gave earlier to Councillor Alford around the slightly chaotic way in which local government is funded by central government. We found out, I think, at the end of November that the £2.8 million that we get from the Household Support Fund, £2.8 million that goes towards helping some of the most vulnerable residents in our community who are most impacted by the cost of living crisis. We found out, I think, at the end of November that that was going to stop. We now hear rumours that actually there'll be an announcement about this in the budget. Of course, the budget doesn't actually come out until the 8th of March, which is after we're supposed to have set our budgets in local government. It's yeah, this really does go back to what I was saying about how difficult it is to try and balance these. We allocated £1 million to support for the cost of living last year as part of the budget. This is money that wasn't going there before. That's is there to fund our cost of living programs to help those who most need it. And we've got a number of other discretionary programs as well, but we'll certainly be keeping an eye out on what the Chancellor says, what money is available. And we do have policy contingencies that will be able to fund services depending on where we find ourselves in March.
Thank you very much. Can I look to the members' questions?
We really had the answers to the ones that I'd asked, which Mr. Kelsey wrote down.
So let me make a couple of comments on those things. So Danny, in one of his slides, indicated that over the past few years or so, the Housing Solutions team have generated savings of almost 1.5 million. Now, that was achieved through a combination of things. We've been working with our private sector landlords to try to make sure that we can contain the costs as best as we can, whilst making sure we maximize all the income that we generate. We've tried to look at the presentations on people who've come to the council as being homeless. We've worked with the private sector landlords to prevent those evictions, all those other arrangements that we can do. We've worked across authorities in London to benefit and to try to make sure that we can get supply accommodation adequately. So those measures have been taken overall to reduce that. We've had a look at the team as well. And Danny, you referred to some of that as well in terms of how we've tried to reduce the level of agency spend and therefore recruiting more permanently to our establishment and more temporary and more permanent staff. But alas, those savings that we've been made, and they've been significant, 1.5 million over the past few years, and they're from those sources. The pressures are such on the homelessness service, and the number of people that are presenting themselves from all the reasons that Danny has articulated, it just overwhelms that. But we will continue those strategies that we put in place to work with the private sector landlords, to work with our registered providers, to work with London authorities to see how we can secure that supply and to make sure we manage and contain the costs overall best as we can. You also talked a little bit about the acquisition position, which you mentioned. So the best example I can give for that is that the council last June acquired some properties from a housing association that was exiting the sector. It potentially exposed the council to making a number of vulnerable people, children and young adults, potentially homeless and without a tenancy. So the council secured that and acquired those properties to maintain those tenancies. So we'll continue to look at options whether we are able to secure that while the market is able to provide those properties too. I think Councillor recovered the point on the provisions and the balances. I think you were also talking about the HRA reserves. I think Danny will come to those in a few moments.
Go a little bit further on the acquisitions. I sat in, I think it was cabinet meeting, when we discussed the purchase of Lily Road, which again, I thought it was I wasn't disagreeing with it. Are you talking about actually buying property for these? Is that what you're, so enlarging your housing portfolio? Is that what you're?
Yeah, so I mean, this council is committed to enlarging the portfolio through two major means. Okay, one is our development programme, where we're the developer and we use private market sales to cross-subsidise the cost of increasing the affordable housing stock in the borough. The other is buying affordable homes directly, where they're part of a larger development, and due to our enforcement and encouragement, we have quite a high proportion of affordable homes come through in each development in the borough. But there are occasions where, particularly at the moment, there's an opportunity for the council because many of the housing associations have backlogs on repairs and other costs and are acquiring fewer properties. Okay, so we've been able to progress some conversations with developers to obtain homes, affordable homes at a good price to help increase our stock. That also has the benefit of diversifying the age of our stock, which you'll know very well, Councillor Alford, as Victorian Street stock and mid-20th century estate. So having some newer stock there with lower maintenance costs and lower energy costs for tenants is helpful too. So I hope that answers on acquisition. On you're asking about temporary accommodation, the pressures there. I mean, they're immense, and as Danny said, you know, inflation in private census is highest in London, homelessness rates are highest in London, and you know the general pressures facing council finances are particularly acute. So there's a bit of a sort of perfect storm in this area, and we're very grateful for the additional funding into it because it's such an important area for the council. But I think where we are hoping to adjust in this financial year is because we have worked very hard this financial year to clear the majority of the repairs backlog, to increase the proportion of complex repairs being done, to dramatically reduce the number of outstanding damp and mold cases in the borough. The need to decant people who existingly live with us should reduce the next financial year, opening up more opportunities for people living in temporary accommodation. So I think that's an important point to make. And then on staffing, you mentioned agency costs, and I'm sure there's a conundrum here for you, Councillor Alford, as a long-standing councillor, that you know, they seem to be driven down every year, and you must be thinking into negative numbers of agency staff. But there has been a slight uptick in the number of agency staff in housing last year, and that's because the council has strong financial foundations, and when hit with services that needed improving and quickly, we could move in those markets to do so. Now, as services improve, we can then increase the proportion of permanent staff again. But it's not just about agency staff, it's also about new management, including the Mr. Sway to my left, and the higher quality of management I think we've now provided in housing. So we're expecting productivity gains, you know, from our staff this year. So that's key to this as well.
One more point, which is relevant, it's to do with temporary accommodation. I quite understand the need that we have to find accommodation where we can and at the best possible price. One of the complaints that I get from people who contact me is that they've been moved out of borough because they're in temporary accommodation. Now, I realise it's difficult, but how do we manage people's expectations of it saying that, yes, we have a duty to house you, but we don't have a duty to house you in the borough? Because that's one of the biggest complaints. I quite understand. I'm not disagreeing with why we have to do it. What I'm asking is how are we going to manage people's expectations that they don't think that, regretfully, if they become homeless or temporary accommodation, that it will automatically be in this borough, because it does have an impact on for their medical needs, their schooling. It's not just where they live, it's the impact, particularly if it's a family.
No, and we do of course have those honest conversations, Councillor Alford, and you're very right. I think you've almost inferred the answer yourself. I mean, different families have different compositions, different needs, and greater need to be local or less local within that. So it's very much about the individual conversation. But I mean, there are certainly London boroughs who are housing people in need of housing further from the borough than we are. So it's not a particularly acute issue here compared to some of the London boroughs.
That we are actually better than some, because some people are sending the people from London up to Birmingham and all places not. I'm not saying that. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, and it's a very difficult solution. But we don't seem to quite manage to get the message to the people who are coming to us why we have to, because we don't have the available stock. It's really about the management of it, and that's a staffing conundrum.
I think you're right, Councillor Alford. I think one of the things which we've got to get better about honesty and be empathetic and be realistic about things and say what we can do and what we can't do. Maybe in the past we've tried to help people all the time and we want to do the best. Let's be brutally honest. That's what we do in housing. We want to help and support people, but we also got to be honest what we can do. I was, asked by several West London local authorities to get involved in doing things outside London. No, that's not what we do here. We focus in Hammersmith and Fulham, and that's what we're undertaking. Talking about temporary accommodation, one thing's what we are being a lot better is about commissioning and contract management. And that's where we will actually find the savings and understand about how we can actually make things better. and having that understanding and that approach about contract management in the private sector rental market. So that is where we're looking to do. And the final thing, it's about also, as Councillor Ree and Savinder's mentioned, and Danny and John has all talked about, as being a bit more agile, and the structure has to be a little bit more agile and understand the needs of the residents' needs and be resident-centric service, you know, about being responsible, accountable, the RACI process, which we need to do on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. Any more questions? Councillor Sadiq.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I would like to thank to Councillor Rowan Ree and the officers for their hard work and within the limited resources from the central government and putting proposal and which they'll present the budget hopefully on the 28th to the council. And I would like to know, for the clarity of this PAC committee and the residents, is due to this limited resources and due to balancing our resources, 19 threshold of 19 to 23 millions, and is there any services cut for the resident, or is there anything we compromised, or do you think in the future will be the service standard or statutory duty will be affected due to this unlimited resources? And then I'll come back to the second question for the housing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I can take that. So you're absolutely right to point out that since 2010, our central grant has been cut by 55%, more than half in real terms. Now, there aren't many organisations around that could continue delivering the same services, the same quality of services, with less than half of the resources. But that is something we've been able to do here in Hammersmith and Fulham. And in fact, not just delivering the same services, but we've gone further, delivering new services, things like the free breakfast in primary schools, things like free home care charges, so abolishing home care charges, things like the new law enforcement team. You know, as Sigmund Kelsey said, we've managed to remove £118 million of spending from our budgets without impacting core services. So to answer your question, no, that there aren't services that we're cutting. You know, in the future, we're going to try and maintain that approach, right? You know, we're here to, one of our core objectives is to try and protect the services that residents most rely on. That means finding money every year to make sure that we don't have to make these cuts. We talked about budget gaps of £12 million a year. And yeah, that's what the residents pay us for, right? To make sure that we're finding those savings without, you know, impacting the services that they rely on. I mentioned the 4 corporate projects that we're going to be undertaking to try and deliver efficiencies across the whole of the council. I think we're past the point of salami slicing when it comes to savings in local government. You know, the low-hanging fruit's been well and truly picked and eaten, and you know, it's not there anymore, right? We're looking at making big changes to how the council operates to make sure that we're protecting those frontline services and providing them the most efficient way possible. We're going to be looking at things like commercialisation. We're going to be looking at our property portfolios. We're going to be looking at the staff that the council employ, and we're going to be looking at our, you know, how we use the data that we have from residents to see if there's anything that we can be doing to deliver the services that they need in the most efficient way possible.
And thank you for clarifying. I understand we are offering more services even within the limited resources to the local residents. Our council is in better position. We are not in danger like other councils, like 1 of 5 councillors in the country. So we are in safe position. Thank you for your hard work. And my second question is to housing, homelessness. I understand this is increasing due to the high inflation, like we have from the residents. Even people are earning more than 40K, still they cannot afford the privately, you know, rents mark is very high. They cannot, if they're living with their families, and they cannot afford. They are forced to be homeless and they have to go, or they have to have some support, external support. In this situation, when we have a lot of homelessness like is increasing due to the weather, due to the rough sleeping, due to the private renting, and I understand we have a limited resources to tackle this, and we are rehousing the people like out of the borough. We don't have a lot of accommodation within the borough. My question is there any time limit? Or is there our new hub, which we are starting, a family hub, one-stop shop for the housing services? Is there any information will be given when they will be rehoused within the borough, or how they can contact within the family hub, one-stop shop, and I mean to come back to the same borough, or they have to be staying over there for unlimited period? Like this type of questions we have from the residents, how we can answer them, if you can make some clarity on this. I know that we have the limited resources. I know we have the limited budget. I know we have the limited houses, and we are trying to buy the more houses and trying to support the residents. But do we have any timeline, or do we have any further information to the one-stop shop or hub where the residents can get directly information?
I mean, I think it's a very good question. I think the first point I'll make, Mitch may want to come in, but it's quite hard to give a generic answer, because again, different households, different families have different needs and will be in different places in the wait for housing. And we do remain very much in contact and two-way contact with families and households who are placed outside the borough. So we can't answer the kind of the time frame, because it will vary from household to household. But as I said, we're working hard to improve our stock, make more use of our stock, which can hopefully mean that pressure on temporary accommodation lessens a bit, allowing some more households to come back to the borough. Something else to add, Richard?
Yeah, thank you, John. One of the things what Councillor Ume has tasked us to look at is about homelessness prevention, stopping and looking at how we can actually try and ensure that we have people prevent homelessness, and that is an area of work which we need to develop more. And that is, we've seen some activity there where in the past we would wait for people to say that they're going to be homeless, come here, look and process the application, rather than look at that, how can we actually prevent them not being homeless? So we're doing a lot working with residents and families to understand the issues about that. And that's something which we then can actually ensure that we can keep those residents in the borough. The things which you've asked about, well, if people are outside the borough wanting to come back in, I appreciate that is a difficulty, and we are looking at things on case-by-case basis. And we do explain to people that that might not happen, or this is how long it will take. But as you know, Councillor, we will take those inquiries and we will look at them on case-by-case basis. But I haven't got a magic wand to bring everybody in, unless I build loads of skyscrapers in the borough, which that's something which is going to take many years to actually bring people on board into the borough.
One thing I think just to add, I mean, it's not just about the council housing people. I mean, local housing allowance was pegged about the 30th percentile of market rent until April 2020. So for 4 years now, it's been frozen and it's fallen behind market rents, reducing the chance of people on benefit being able to access private sector housing. Okay, that's now going to be re-pegged nationally from this April coming up. So the biggest sort of increases will be in high rent areas such as ours. So hopefully more people will be able to access homes, rented homes in the private sector than they have in the last sort of 4 years locally. And then also we do work hard as an organisation with partners across the borough to help people, upskill, gain employment, and avoid, some of the traps of poverty, which again is another excellent route to housing.
Thank you. Could I bring councillor Ume in, please?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think John and Richard have really covered the main points. It was just to add that, you know, I mean, the service has seen an increase in more than 20% of homelessness approaches at the end of last year compared to the previous year. So there is that high demand, and I mean, it's for a number of reasons, Councillor. It could be, as you've mentioned, for economic circumstances, an increase in Section 21 no fault evictions, household composition, as I think Danny was alluding to earlier, with regards to domestic violence, etc. So many different circumstances. And as Richard was saying, the service is committed to providing support from a homelessness prevention perspective as well. And that does include having negotiations with landlords, discussions as much as possible to try and ensure that the family or the resident can remain in that existing accommodation. And where that's not possible, then to provide alternative housing. I think, as John was mentioning before, the local housing allowance, seeing that increase will certainly have an impact on the affordability within the private rented sector. And so increasing that supply of housing too is essential. And then just in addition, to add that, yeah, I mean, absolutely, those lines of communication with residents who are within temporary accommodation need to remain consistently open, and they are. There is more that can be done, certainly, to provide assurance, to ensure that families are aware of the different channels they can use to find accommodation or find support. So, for instance, the online system where residents can bid for a home, using that as one of the channels to sort of look out for suitable accommodation. But there is certainly more that can be done to maintain that communication between officers as well as residents, and there is work to ensure that happens. Excellent point. Thank you for raising.
Thank you for your clarity and hard work. I understand for the clarity of the residents watching online, we will have the solution, and officers are working hard, and in one-stop shop and housing hub will give the better solution in coming days, hopefully. Thanks.
Yeah, just to add on that, it's a good point. As Councillor Ree was mentioning before, those hubs, and Richard mentioned this too, will also provide that added space for continued dialogue, for queries to be responded to, support to be given, in addition to some of the established places that we have around the borough as well. But yeah, it's also an additional avenue to provide that support.
Thank you. Councillor Alexander, would you have some questions?
Yes. Not a question. I'd just like to register my thanks. There's nothing more to add than that. But thank you very much for all your work. And it's clearly a better than expected response, given the environment that we're operating in at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. We really appreciate saying so.
Thank you very much. I believe there's a housing revenue account to take us through as well. And we didn't receive a report on this one, so.
I do like to have reports. I do think and I have raised this with the Director of Finance, that I think we should have a report, particularly in view of, I've already seen half the report, but when I attended with Councillor Ume, the Sheltered Housing Forum, and I believe a lot of it's based on the same things. So it seems a little strange if it can come to one forum, that it should be able to come to a PAC.
So, I mean, I think, Sukhvinder, you're going to jump in. So with the Sheltered Housing Forum, that was part of the consultation with residents, and that was shared at that meeting. So similarly, the approach here is to share that information at this meeting with the committee to get the feedback and comments as well.
With respect, Councillor Ume, we got the papers for that at the Sheltered Housing Forum, printed papers. I had them.
I understand that was for electronic or technical issues, and the presentation was supposed to happen live at the meeting, and that discussion was supposed to happen in that way. So I think officers gave apologies for that at the meeting at the time.
And I think Richard, having it in paper.
Thank you for the feedback. I think Richard has something to add as well.
Councillor Alford, I apologise on behalf of the housing service that the way that we should be doing is the way that we should be doing it here. The reason why we did it on paper format was down to technical IT issues, which we should have explained and addressed the situation and dealt with it before the meeting occurred, which will happen from now on.
Thanks, Richard.
Sorry, can I ask if we could have the presentation with the minutes as a sort of report? Oh, that'd be lovely. Mr. Kelsey.
Councillor Daly, thank you very much. If I may, I just wanted to sort of try to reassure members of this committee about the regular and the robust reporting on the financial position of the council that is made. So Cabinet receives periodic reports during the year, month 2, 4, 6, and indeed 6 was only considered at Cabinet on the 15th of January. That does include the council's overall position, including the HRA overall. And of course, there are other reports during the year that are dedicated specifically to the HRA. So I think we're expecting, Councillor Alford, you'll expect to see a report on the 12th of February on the HRA. Notwithstanding that, we'll do better. Next year, I think what we'll do is, Councillor Alford has said that the papers that Dan is about to go through were shared at the Sheltered Housing Board. They're no different other than the title, I think, is just been changed from there. So you might be a bit bored, Councillor Alford, on this, but you'll have to go through the presentation. But they're there, and we'll ensure that they come out with the minutes. Councillor Daly.
Thank you very much. Very kind.
Thank you. I'm also here to present the proposals for the housing revenue account budget and the rent and service charge changes that will be taking place from April this year. Again, I've set out a contents page where I will be taking you through the current financial and strategic operating environment for the housing revenue account. There will be an overview of the revised housing revenue account 10-year business plan, as well as some detail on the HRA budget proposed for the next financial year, including changes to the rents and the tenant service charges. I'll also give you an insight into the capital programme of improvements to our residents' homes and provide a bit more information on key financial indicators for the housing operation. So the current service and financial operating environment is as it was with the last presentation, is extremely challenging. The housing sector is perhaps more impacted by recent global and national events than many other sectors. There are increasing demands for social and affordable housing. There's an urgent need to address the long-term underinvestment in the condition of our housing stock. The regulator rightly requires improvements in building safety. We are enhancing and improving resident engagement, along with those increased expectations for improvements in services. We're also finding a path towards net zero, as housing accounts for 3/4 of the council's CO2 emissions. And as John mentioned earlier, we're turning around the performance of the repairs service. On the finance side, the ongoing national economic climate of high inflation and interest rates increases the cost of service delivery. It increases pressure on collecting rental income as household incomes come under pressure. It makes our investment plans more expensive. It makes borrowing to fund those plans more expensive, and it increases the demand for housing services. And on top of that, the vast majority of our rents are below target rent, which is the level that the government expects them to be at. And it's difficult for us to build financial plans in the medium term because government's not told us what national rent policy will be after next year. So the HRA budget strategy aims in this context to achieve 4 key outcomes: ensuring that our tenants receive high quality housing services, delivering those key housing priorities, including the condition of tenants and residents' homes, as well as building new homes, improving service performance, such as enabling the issues such as damp, mold, disrepair to be quickly and effectively dealt with, and making certain that the HRA continues to be managed well financially so that we can provide a foundation to provide our tenants with the best possible housing service. So the 10-year business plan, that's a key document that ensures the long-term sustainability of the housing service. What it does is take various factors into account, such as the importance of improving and investing in our residents' homes, our housing development plans, our understanding of what the expectations are for national rent policy. It takes account of interest rates. It takes account of predictions of inflation to get our best understanding of what likely financial outcomes are over that 10-year period. And we can use that to help make sure that whatever plans we have, that they're financially resilient. So some of the key outcomes from that financial modelling include that we are going to increase the number of council homes by up to almost 900 homes over that 10-year period. We're going to spend nearly £1,730 million on residents' homes over the next 10 years. That's a huge number. And we are going to maintain a minimum of £5 million in our reserves to act as a cushion to protect the HRA from any unexpected events. And that also will include with it a plan over that 10-year period to make at least £14 million of savings from the budget. There's also a need to spend heavily on day-to-day repairs at present, but as more investment is undertaken in council homes over time, that ratio of repairs spend as a proportion of rent income will improve from around 36% next year, and it will drop down to about 33% over that 10-year period. There's also going to be a significant increase in the amount of borrowing that we need to pay for those improvements, but we're going to make sure that it won't amount to any more than 55% of the value of the housing stock. And that's useful to know because that's a good indication that we're managing the finances in a sustainable manner. So much like Vinda talked about the council's general fund earlier, we've got some assumptions about pay inflation and price and contract indexation. Pay inflation, we're expecting to be around 3% on the assumption that inflation continues to fall. We've got a range of housing management and repairs contracts, many of which we've entered into agreements, which means we'll increase the amount that we pay to the contractor each year in line with the consumer prices index. However, we do have other contracts where through negotiation it's been possible to agree lower rates of inflation that's allowed us to limit the average increase in cost to around 5%. We are losing rental income due to the number of void properties that we currently have. It's at a rate currently closer to 3%, but a voids reduction plan has already been put in place and is going to return average void levels to around 2% of the stock next year. At 90%, the provision for tenant arrears is more than adequate. The HRA has about 7.4 million of rent arrears at present, and we've already provided for 6.8 million of that. So that's a very prudent protection over that level of arrears. And we've also made some changes to our assumptions about how much it's going to cost to take out extra borrowing, and that's gone up from an interest rate of 2.5% to 4% overall. On rents, the government has announced that national social rent policy will be for a rent increase of up to 7.7%. That's based on the September 2023 Consumer Prices Index plus 1%. There's no cap on rent increases next year, like there was for this year. But in light of this, the council is proposing a rent increase of 7.7% from April 2024 for our general needs and sheltered housing tenants. That's equivalent on average to an increase of around £9.62 per week. We are proposing to increase tenant service charges on average by about £3.18 per week. Those increases are more modest than the increases that you may remember that we put through back in November 22. And that's because now that we have restored the link between the costs of providing communal services and the amount that we charge for those, we're now recovering our costs. So subsequent annual increases will be much more in line and a reflection of inflationary increases in the general economy. And of course, if there are any changes to the configuration of the way a particular service is run. There's also some news on heating and hot water charges, and I'm very pleased to be able to confirm that there will be a reduction in charges from April of around £1.87 per week for the personal element of the heating charge, and a further 41 pence reduction for the communal service. That's an average reduction, as it was with the service charges. It's not necessarily the reduction that a particular individual's home will get, because the charges depend on the size, the peculiarities of a particular home and what level of service is provided at that home. But on average, that's the reduction that our tenants can expect. The other thing is personal heating isn't eligible for housing benefit. So that means that will be money back in our tenants' pockets. So that's a really good thing. I'd now like to give you a bit more information about the budget proposals.
Danny, can I interrupt you for just a second, if you don't mind? I didn't want to, but I just wanted to make a couple of points for the committee just to be aware of on the last slide where Danny talked about the rent levels for a moment. It's probably just worth saying that we will help our residents and make sure that we provide as much support as we can to them through the local initiatives that we've got, and we'll make sure they maximise benefit entitlement wherever they can. Almost half our residents will be able to recover most of that through housing benefit overall. I think the other thing I wanted to say is that in my mind, a social tenancy is really worth its weight in gold. It comes with a secure tenancy. You've heard earlier about some of the things that residents face in the private sector, the Section 21 notices, no sort of fault evictions and so on. And they've also got quite a good degree of public scrutiny as well. They can come to members to get their issues sorted out and dealt with. And social rents at the moment in the borough at about £125 or so a week, £500 a month. They're probably about half of what they are in a registered provider, in a housing association, in all language, in my mind, and probably about a third of the level they're at for a private rented sector. So they're still trying to rent good value for money. And what the council is trying to do, as Danny has said in the proposals, is to make sure that long term, this very, very important resource for 12,000 homes, 1 in 6 people in the borough, in my estimate, live in a council house, that is protected for the future for them, and that the council housing service maintains resilience overall. Sorry, Danny, I just wanted to just make a couple of those.
No, thank you for that. Right, yes, the proposed budget for 24-25. This slide sets out the budget for next year and the changes from this year. So the financial position of the HRA has improved considerably from 2022-23. Then we started out with a base deficit of 4.1 million in that year. That means we were spending 4.1 million more pounds than the actual income that we received. We've moved to a 3.6 million shortfall this year. And if you look at the revised budget 23-24 column, there's a line that has the annual deficit of 1.4 million. And if you add the temporary use of reserves that we've included, that's what that 3.6 million shortfall in the HRA is this year. But for 2024-25, you can see in the far right that there's no numbers there. And that's because the deficit on the HRA has been fully eliminated for 24-25. And that's a real milestone achievement. And it means that we'll be able to maintain a minimum reserve of £5 million going forward. And we will no longer need to rely on reserves. And you will see from the rents figure at the top of this slide that we will generate an extra 6.2 million in income next year. This slide shows the major movements between this year and next year by type of spend. So, as I said, we've removed the budget deficit. We'll generate additional income from rents, and that will cover pay inflation, contractual inflation, the increased interest payments due to increases in both the interest rate and the amount of borrowing that we're going to be taking out to invest in the stock. And we've also been able to include a contingency for additional investment should that be needed. So that leaves us with an HRA where the planned spend is covered from income, strengthening financial resilience and allowing reserves to remain stable into the future. As mentioned earlier, the rent increase equates to on average a £9.62 increase. Tenant service charges, we've listed out all of the different charges. These are only the average increases, but I want to be clear that tenants will receive a range of increases and in some cases reductions depending on which services are provided at their home. The majority of those charges are increasing in line with inflation, which is what one would expect. But there are some exceptions. There's two exceptions where the increases will be more significant. That's caretaking and communal lighting, and another where the charge will reduce, which I mentioned earlier, heating and hot water charges. So just on the caretaking one, just to explain that one, that's increasing because not only is it impacted by the level of general inflation, which we're contractually committed to applying, but also because the council is committed to making sure that its staff and its contractors' staff are paid fairly under the London Living Wage. Next slide, please. So to provide you with a bit of further context on the financial position, we currently have £10 million in the HRA General Reserve after the budgeted drawdown of 1.4 million and those temporary actions which cost 2.2 million to support improvements. And with an overspend that we're currently projecting of 1.4 million this year, that means we will have 5 million left in our reserves next year. But as we've now balanced the budget from 24-25 onwards, there's no need to rely on reserves and we'll be able to sustain that £5 million level. This slide here gives you an insight into the housing capital investment plans over a 4-year period. We've divided the expenditure up into the asset management and compliance programme, which is that top line and relates to improvements in council homes. That will cost about 200 million over the next 4 years. But also we've got the net zero or climate emergency plans to decarbonise the housing stock. And as well, there's other 2 lines which really refer to the new build development programme. And taking those all together, that's more than £750 million of capital investment over that period. The key impact is those borrowing numbers at the bottom of the table. We're planning to borrow another £64 million next year, and that borrowing has become more expensive, although there are now encouraging signs that borrowing rates may be coming down in the medium term, though not to the levels we've seen in the last 10 years or so. But that planned level of borrowing, as I said earlier, that we need to improve homes is sustainable within the 10-year business plan. A couple of key metrics. The council's homes account for one of the biggest numbers on the council's balance sheet, and they're valued at around 1.5 billion under the lower social housing valuation, but nearly 6 billion as an open market value. Current level of external borrowing is £219 million. So that means that the average borrowing of £18,000 per council home is much less than the average £125,000 value of your home. residents' homes, council homes. So that's much less than the level of borrowing per property common among registered housing providers. So this means basically that there's room for that additional borrowing that we're planning. It's sustainable. And I've already mentioned that the rent arrears are more adequately provided for with a 90% provision. So that brings me on to the last slide, which just lets you know that we've already been to the Sheltered Housing Forum and the Housing Representatives Forum in the last 2 weeks. And any feedback from tenants and residents from those meetings and from this one, of course, can be taken into account, and the report with those proposals will then be taken to Cabinet on the 12th of February.
Thank you very much, Danny. Thank you for that presentation. Can I ask you really quickly before I kind of pass it around? You talk about going to the forums in the last couple of weeks, those 2 forums. How has the budget and the rent increase and the service charge changes been received?
I think that there is an acceptance and an understanding that we are still living through a cost of living crisis, and that affects people in the street. It affects everybody across the country. It affects councils who are having to deliver services. So I think that I would conclude that there is a reluctant acceptance that these are increases that have to happen, and people understand that we are managing services and making improvements within the financial envelope that we have, I think.
And we have sort of support for residents who really are struggling, and that's being communicated through the family hubs and through the
yes, we actually do. Yes, we have a recognition that those proposed increases in the rents and service charges will inevitably, for some, cause financial hardship. But we do know that around 50% of our tenants will be supported financially automatically through housing benefit and universal credit. All of our tenant service charges, when we implemented them back in 2012, we made sure that they were all eligible under housing benefit rules. So when we increased them, those 50% of tenants that are on those benefits get those increases paid for. And then, of course, we've got a wider package of support to residents during the cost of living crisis. We have a dedicated welfare benefits team who can guide residents through the process of applying for universal credit or for making referrals to additional support services and hardship funds that they may be eligible for, such as discretionary housing payments, and possibly, depending on what that announcement is in March, the household support fund.
Thank you. Richard, do you have something to add?
Not really, Councillor Daly. Only to say it was mixed, but people understand and rationalise why we're doing it. I think the other thing I would like to point out is that people are starting to see the improvements about complaint management and handling, and also the work what we've done with repairs, and they can see the vision of what we're trying to do and develop. And I think we are on that journey of moving the HRA into a better place.
Thank you very much.
Chair, might I just add to that, please?
Please do.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, no, it was just to add, in addition to what Danny and Richard have also shared, just in terms of feedback from the consultation discussions with residents, that yeah, it was mixed, and naturally having to share a proposal around the budget is going to be difficult to share that, but also to receive that. And I think what was helpful for residents, and perhaps John and Richard may want to share a bit more, Richard, you already have, is just hearing a bit more about the action being taken to ensure the service is being improved, to address the financial challenges that are being faced, the support that's being offered to residents. It was really appreciated hearing about the housing fund as well as the housing benefits that would be applied to more than 50% of residents. But if there is anything else that John and Richard wants to add, Richard, you have added something about the action and the robust work that's happening within the service, and please do.
I think the final thing I would just like to add is that people are appreciative of the way that we're doing it and understand the concepts. And yes, nobody likes increases, but they can also understand, they can see the benefits of what we're trying to do. And that's, for me, is where I've been elsewhere, where it's not gone that well. This process has been a lot better, and it's been done in partnership with residents to understand some of the issues which they're facing as well.
Thank you very much. Members, look, Councillor Alexander.
Yes, please. I've got a few, and I'll just take them in the order that I wrote them down, if you don't mind. So at the moment we're looking at the CO2 reductions and carbon zero really as a headline figure. So that tends to just favour doing something big on a big estate and getting that number down. What I want to see is more resident-driven initiatives, and I want to see resident ideas promoted, quite often because they live in these properties, and without the council's help, they will never be able to speak in terms that a surveyor will, because the surveyor will say, "Oh, well, this government rule and that objective," and I want to see more. The HRA, residents and leaseholders, they see that as something that's associated with them, and I want them to be more involved, particularly at the leaseholder level, just because they have more access to the raw information about what contractors are charging and what work's actually being done. At the moment, I'm sure, and I'm just guessing, I bet you get tons and tons of lengthy leaseholder letters querying this and querying that on leaseholder bills. A lot of that could be cut just by the way that's managed, and it should be seen as this is an opportunity, because quite often within that leaseholder, it's an opportunity to bring contractors to account and to deal with jobs that haven't been done and work that haven't, and I want to see very much that being captured and used with leaseholders to a far greater extent than it is. The major projects, they're very geared around outcomes, but it's really their outputs rather than the outcomes for residents. So the way they will select how they roll a project out and the details of that project will tend to be based around their delivery rather than the bigger objectives. So just, if you don't mind, a loose made up off the top of my head example, a security system, major projects will, yeah, great. There's that great big estate over there. We can put 5,000 of these units in and we can do this. However, if you actually looked further beyond that and spoke to the residents, we'd find that the place where the police and all the other council services are being absorbed is a much smaller place without any of these things. So I want more resident-driven ones on the programme, so as a separate issue to the ones. So when you're rolling out major projects, I want residents far more involved in how you're rolling them out and the timing of those, because otherwise we could be missing some great savings.
Councillor Alexander, would you like us to ask for a report from the leaseholder forums to come back to the committee at some point?
No, I don't want that. I want specific, because I do understand how the leaseholder forum works, and that's a specific one that needs to be dealt with on that. On a couple of the detail issues, I saw when it went up, and this is for a later date, the TV aerials and the communal lighting charges that you went through. I would like to just drill into the detail again, not here, but at another date. And the other will be the idea of the relationship between major projects and reactive repairs. And broadly speaking, I would say that they've got it right, and that we don't want to beat them up over that, but there's a lot of loose, low-hanging fruit that we can grab hold of on that, where their reactive repairs are falling or becoming problems of a major one. Now, the next one is on forums. Sorry, this is the last one I wanted to speak that I want to see is a far better involvement from a much broader number of people. We've got a great housing forum, but if you look and see the residents who are able to participate in that, a lot of that is driven by TRA registrations, and the system for TRA registrations changed in 2015, which means you very rarely get any representation from people from smaller estates or from street properties. And there's a lot of money going there. If you look at the cost of just fixing a roof on a street property on a per resident basis, it costs you a fortune compared to fixing the roof on a large estate building. So there are good financial reasons to do it, as well as the common sense one. So I want to see the far more residents being involved in the residents forum and far more assistance for them to do that, because quite often they're quite timid, or they might live in a street property that's got 6 or 7 flats in it, and that's you know, they don't really feel they've got a voice. I'd like to see them having a voice. Chair, thank you very much for your indulgence.
Thank you. Is it possible to have residents involved in budget setting? And what would be the kind of complications of that?
So sorry, I'll just say it wasn't at that level I wanted to see them doing it. I want them to be involved in getting in the.
Yeah. Can I reply?
Sorry, not about the budget, not about the finances of it, but just about general running. Is that your question? Sorry to ask you to clarify. Is it about the budget, or is that about?
I think Richard probably understands, and he's better able to explain what I meant to say.
I think Councillor Alexander is wanting to see a lot more from capital programmes teams, a bit more community engagement, where you have project managers actually take ownership of the projects and actually explain about what the great work, what we're looking to do. We haven't been very good at that, and that's an area of work which both Councillor and John has said that we need to get better at and do a lot more. And I think that way you have the project manager actually being seen by residents and be seen as the go-to person, and actually work with leaseholders and tenants about the range of ways and means about what needs to occur. That's where I've done it elsewhere, and that's what we're going to start doing here over the next year. So
my apology.
So I think that's what Councillor Alexander you're wanting to see.
So not about budgets, just about programmes moving forwards. Lovely.
It will help with the budget, because people will then understand about the amount of money which we're spending, and then they can actually see the development and opportunities which we're doing on behalf of the residents.
Yeah. Thank you, Richard. And sorry, Chair, if I have to get Richard to... Can I,
Madam Chair, if I just... Oh, sorry.
It's fine.
Yeah, I mean, just 2 points. I mean, there's something there about ensuring we kind of communicate programmes improvement works, you know, when they're happening, how they're happening, the inconvenience, how we're mitigating that, etc. Now, that's good programme management. As Richard says, we're striving to do more and better in that field. But I think there's something really, really important in what you were saying there, actually, about that kind of co-producing of the programme. So the council doesn't kind of come up with it in isolation and tell people about it. So you're really kind of listening to residents about what's important on their estates or their streets, how to do it, how to engage, and really learning from that you know, amazing kind of knowledge base and collective wisdom that's out there. So I think that's a fantastic point. That's something we can do more of, whether it's about those programs or it's about greening, and there's a number of different applications. And then the second point I just wanted to make was, you talked about the links between capital programs and responsive repairs, and you were kind enough to say that, you know, generally we're prioritising the right estates in the right order to drive down repairs. And I agree with you. And there was analysis of repairs data, complaints data, etc. The information we had to hand to generate and prioritise that capital programme. But we are now at 9,000 stock condition surveys completed. So 9,000 homes have been visited. And that is enough to then have an evidence base to develop an asset management strategy. That's not to say we're going to stop there, because in line with best practice set by the government regulators for social housing, we want to progress. So we've done the vast majority, at least, of homes. But and we intend to go to market in coming weeks for consultants to do that asset management strategy with the council. That will really kind of bring to life our evidence base, our prioritisation, and help us inform a long-term plan for capital investment in our estates in a way that we've not been able to do in recent years. I'll pass to Councillor May.
Thank you. I mean, you've covered it, and in essence, just to say thank you for the really helpful points, because co-production is really important, not least within the capital programme work, but also more broadly, as you raised, through tenant resident associations and other channels as well, to think about other ways in which residents can ensure that their voices are heard, whether that's within the forum structure, obviously with the Social Housing Act coming into force, looking at how we can do that much more effectively and talking to residents at the moment about doing that much more effectively, but ensuring there are different channels that are also available to do that too is really important.
Thank you very much. Any final questions? More questions?
So I'll be very brief. I would like to say thank you for your comprehensive presentation and your short-term and long-term policy and strategy, and explaining to this committee and the residents. And secondly, I understand in the last 2 years, we have a lot, everyone knows the residents, we have a Brexit, we have a COVID-19, we have a high living cost, we have inflations. Apart from this, still this budget is very balanced, and we are not doing any cuts in services and offering more to the residents. And hopefully the housing services is improving, and we have a one-stop shop and hub, and where we'll get the more and more in the coming days, like the Richard said. And thank you very much for your hard work. Is more like a comments, no question. Thank you.
Councillor Alford?
Yes, I'm afraid I once again have questions, and I also would carry on from what Councillor Alexandra said. I met one of my residents last night on Chasemore. Now, Chasemore is a small block adjacent to where the rebuild of Lannoy and Hartop is, for those who are not aware. They've now been told that they are having major works done, rather to their shock, that they're being told they have to have cladding. In view of, I think, if we're going to say to our residents they're having cladding, we better explain what this cladding is, because after Grenfell, it has put the fear of God into them. And that is bad for us. And the other thing is, clearly nobody's surveyed these properties, because when they were talking about what they were going to do with the new windows, they had new windows 15 years ago. They're now being told they've got to have new windows again. They don't realise they've got patio windows. They've got specialist doors. They were pretty upset when they had the meeting of what was going to happen to them, how little, I regret to say, the council officers knew about the block, which does not show a good costing. Because if we're going to do all this work, and we're going to spend a lot of money, we need to know what we're going to spend the money on, not go in. And this has happened before, so I would like to raise that and to involve the residents. There was only 3 residents who went to the meeting.
Okay.
That's the first thing. The second thing is I would like to congratulate Mr. Rochford on his management of the HRA account. And please don't take this the wrong way, Mr. Rochford. I hope you're right, and that we don't have any more deficits. And if you've managed that, that is an excellent achievement. The only thing I would say, and I am delighted to hear that hopefully next year we don't have a deficit in the HRA, but I have got here the key recommendations from the audit from Grant Thornton, and they themselves raised the concerns about the level of the balances in the HRA and raised it as a concern. You talk about not depleting the balances any further. Are we going to be able to increase the balances? So we build it up to a more, the reserve, so the reserve is increased, not holding steady at 5, because 5 is not a good figure. So that's one question. And then the next thing is, and it's 2 other points, but it's rather scattergun. One is, why is it a 90% of a rent arrears? Is that what you're saying? That we're having to make a provision? And why have we got such an incredibly high figure? And the final figure, which is again, looking at the long term, is why are we increasing doubling the leaseholder contributions at the end of the plan? Because it's gone from 33 to 70. What was it, the figures? I'm sorry, because I haven't got the figures in front of me. I can't quote the figures accurately to you. And those are.
Okay, if I just may come back on the first one before we pass to finance. So, I mean, thank you for the information about the resident meeting and the feedback. I mean, I'm sure there's very good reasons for the planned investment, and apologies if they've not been conveyed as clearly as they could to residents. So, we'll arrange a note for you. That'll be our pleasure.
I keep on stressing this. The fear people have of cladding, they really do have it. It's a deep ingrained fear. And these are, shall we say, very long-term residents. And they pointed out to me, well, we won't even go into Grenfell, but there are things that have happened with previous cladding, which was meant to be, they were assured it wasn't flammable. But I want 1,000% guarantee it's not flammable, because then we do not want, as we've seen all over London when terrible things have happened. I don't want this in this borough.
No, absolutely not, Councillor Orphan, and we understand the associations between cladding and that tragic incident. And whilst, you know, clearly the law and standards have written nationally since then, we understand your concern, and we'll make sure that's communicated well and investigated.
Thank you.
I'll pass to finance.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of comments really on the points that Councillor Alford has raised. So the external auditor's report related to the financial year 22-23 and 21-22. And I think Danny has explained earlier some of the structural position that we had on the HRA, the £4.1 million deficit. I hope the committee is reassured that that deficit was reduced to 1.4 million in the current year, is totally now eliminated moving forward overall. I think for me also looking forward, it's the HRA business plan that Danny provided a little bit of an indication of the overall investment and the sustainability of that. So that will continue to make sure that overall the HRA remains resilient moving forward for the future. So I'm hoping that when the external auditor comes to look at the position for 23-24 and for future years, because we will be working with them, that they will be reassured that the council has rectified some of the issues that it was raising in previous years. And we will be sure to report that to members if there are any concerns there. I just want to make an observation on the reserves position, if I may, the 5 million. We will endeavour to increase that. 5 million may seem, it's smaller than obviously what we've used to here, but it's about 5% or so of the annual spend. Now, in my mind, that's a reasonable amount overall, and we'll report back on that one. I'd be worried about that if the council hadn't got any other provisions elsewhere. So we've fully provided for the, or at least not fully, but 90% on the arrears position. And wherever there are any other risks, Danny has articulated those, so we'll minimize those. So contingency and reserves are there to deal with any unforeseen risks, and we're trying to maintain and mitigate those overall. But we will report that on a regular basis. We will endeavour to increase those balances as soon as we're able to and allowed to do so.
Thank you very much. Could I just come in on the reserves position? So some members of the committee might know that that I'm a Fulham supporter, right? And watching Fulham in the last few years has been a bit of a rocky ride, right? We've perhaps lost more games than we would have liked, but the last couple of years things have petered out, and actually it's quite nice going to watch them now. Fulham is a bit like the HRA, right? You know, some of the rocky performances have been down to previous decisions taken in the past. Some of it's been down to external factors, you know, in this case, other teams being better than us. But yeah, like the HRA account, we're getting to a steadier place. Now, Councillor Robert, I know that this is, yeah, the reserves are something in the HRA are something that you're very concerned about. I know that you've raised it a number of times. I can reassure you that, you know, Councillor Ume and myself, the finance officers, the housing department, it's something that we're all very concerned about as well. We've spoken in the past about the purposes of reserves, you know, there to smooth out longer term spending, there to cover the rainy day funds as well. But yeah, getting back to a more sustainable position with the reserves is something that we've been aiming to do, and I'm glad that we've got to a stage now where we've eliminated the structural deficit and we're not having to dip into the reserves. So I agree it's an excellent achievement that we've managed to get there. So thank you very much for that. In terms of the business plan, one of the things that we've insisted that is built into that is topping up the reserves. You're absolutely right. £5 million is good for now, but the way inflation's going, £5 million will be worth far less in 10 years' time, right? So we're making sure that actually it's a priority to make sure that that is going up as well, so that in the unfortunate event that we do need to call on reserves in the future, there'll be sufficient there to do so.
Because if I could come back to you with that, one of the problems why we've gone into, as I know there have been many reasons, but one is the level of compensation we've been having to pay to, I call ambulance mainly, not, I want them for our tenants, but I don't like the people who are the intermediaries who are really creaming it. And I'm hoping that that is now stopping, or at least depleting, because that is one of the terrible things, because yes, tenants and residents should be compensated because of their housing if it's been unsatisfactory. But I really don't like the third party people taking the percentage.
So Councillor offered to reassure you in a second after a cautionary note, I suppose, that I mean, that industry is showing no signs of abetting nationally. There are businesses operating well outside London, the cities in North England operating in our borough, encouraging us, to work through them rather than through the council. However, the good news is that firstly, via communication, things like posters, outreach to residents, encouraging people to come and report repairs directly is assisting. Secondly, anecdotally, we're hearing there's more confidence when people do report a repair or a problem, it'll actually be dealt with. And thirdly, the work between the repairs team and the legal team has increased together, so it's much more harmonious now and has been for several months. And that, in tandem with additional contractors focusing on cases that gone to disrepair, means that the backlog of those cases is now reducing at a good rate. So I think overall we've lost around 25% since the summer. In terms of repairs, we're down about 20% even over the sort of last month or two. So it's shifting in the right direction. We're expecting that to move further by the end of the financial year. So yes, we recognise that we absolutely do want to support our residents, but that, along with voids, is a kind of unfortunate outflow if not managed well. So that has been a very high priority to bring those cases down. And that's good news. And again, you look at some other councils across the country, and this is, as I said, a national problem where we're hearing cases are skyrocketing. So it's with pleasure I can tell you this is being increasingly managed and the numbers heading in the right direction.
Thank you very much. The evening is wearing on. Mr. Thurloway, I'd love to invite you to come and ask a question. I have to say that we have, as always, a lot of robust, in-depth conversation here and an interrogation, and we are running out of time. Do you have a question that you'd really like to ask? And then perhaps we can take some others away and answer them in writing. Would you like to come to the microphone?
Hello. First question is, Grant Thornton's report dated September 2023 states on page 8, in 2023-24, the council have raised rents by the maximum allowable of 7%. If this statement is true, why was this committee presented with a proposal on the 23rd of January 23 to increase rents by 4.4%, and Cabinet approved this on 6th of February 2023? If it is not true, how come Grant Thornton came to believe it?
Yeah, thank you. Have you got a second question? And
Second question. Second question is, has there been any estimate of what compliance with the Social Housing Regulation Act 2023 will cost, either initially or ongoing? In particular, any initial or ongoing costs of Section 21 regarding the competence and conduct of relevant individuals?
thank you.
Chair, through you, if I may. Mr. Thurlow, thank you for your first question. I think you should take some comfort in the fact that Grant Thornton have made that comments that they've said about the rent increase last year. Can I suggest that I'll have a separate conversation with you and go through the details with you to explain that position more clearly? I think otherwise I'll end up talking detailed numbers here, which I'm sure our residents won't want to hear tonight.
Thank you. Are you happy with that?
Okay.
That progress? Thank you. Lovely. Thank you. Councillor Alford, sorry, Richard, do you have something that you wanted to say?
All I was just saying is that we are getting ourselves ready for readiness of compliance. We are ensuring that staff are compliant from levels 1 to level 5. That's going to take what the Social Housing Act and the regulator has said. They are giving us two years to actually fulfill that, but we are looking at our budgets to ensure that we actually do undertake that as part of our personal development programs and working with our colleagues in people and talent.
Thank you. Mr. Thurlow, thank you. Councillor Alford, do I owe you an apology? Are you still waiting for an answer on something?
This question of 90% rent arrears. And since I'm
okay, so I will take the first question, which was about how the leaseholder contributions. I think you must have seen that on the housing capital programme slide. Yes, one of the slides was the housing capital programme, and that indicated that leaseholder contributions in 24-25 and for the 2 years after that would remain at around £3 million, and then in the 4th year of the capital programme they jumped up to twice that level. That is that increase in the leaseholder contributions is in line with the increase in the expenditure in the asset management and compliance programme. So if you look at that top line, the spend there for the first 3 years was around £40 million, but then in the final year it was closer to 80, hence that doubling of leaseholder contributions. You also wanted a further comment on the level of the provision for tenant arrears.
Why have you got that massive arrears, with respect?
Absolutely. The level of arrears that we have is no less or greater than you'd expect to see in any other authority. We have a prudent approach to providing for that. We have a series of different classifications to which we'll apply a provision depending on whether you're a former tenant or a current tenant, and also the amount of the arrears that tenant has. It's a long-established approach. It is a prudent one. It's been audited multiple times, and it's supported by the auditors, who give us an independent opinion on our approach. So, and particularly, I think it's appropriate during the current economic situation with the cost of living crisis.
Thank you. So let me just kind of finish up by saying that I think we all recognise that we're in a quite a privileged place being here and being presented with a balanced budget. And I think we all just like to thank officers and cabinet members for all the work that they've done. It is considerable and it is very much appreciated. Thank you for coming and joining us this evening. Does the committee members agree to note the presentation stroke report?
Noted.
Thank you. So the date of our next meeting is the 26th of March. Mr. Schroy, can I ask you a quick question? One area that we would really like to bring into PAC is the Housing Ombudsman report, but do you think that we might be able to have a report to look at by March? Or should we plan for that later in the year?
I think, Councillor Daly, I need to look at that and come back to you, if that's okay.
I completely understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Housing Ombudsman has taken their focus off most recently of Hammersmith and Fulham.
Well, we are still with the Housing Ombudsman. We still need to understand where we are with it, and we will need to. Hence, why I think it would be a good idea if I have a discussion about when that report should come back.
Right, lovely. Thank you. So other items that we've got down there: private rented sector policy, and voids management. Thank you so much, everybody who's here, and thank you for anybody who's been watching at home. Have a lovely what's left of the evening.